Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 10. King Philip, Bacon, Gambling, and Witches. Rule 8 of history. Focus on the vices. This is true for several reasons. First and most is pragmatic. It's the sheer entertainment value. Breaking down the history of sex, drugs, and violence captivates audiences, as I've mentioned in earlier podcasts. Our lizard brain deep down in the recesses of our minds are completely captivated by carnal pleasures. Secondly, vices are an innate connection to us all. While you may not have done a line of cocaine off a stripper, you at one point have ingested a stimulant, been in a fight, or been sexually aroused. Vices are, to a certain extent, egalitarian in that respect. And lastly, we need to study the ways vices are suppressed throughout history. Not what people are doing, but why someone would want to stop them from doing it. To err is human, yes? King Philip's War. Historians often argue over smaller nuances of history, but in some cases, they even squabble over what to call the event itself. Also known as the First Indian War, the Great Narragansett War, or Metacom's Rebellion, King Philip's War took place in southern New England from 1675 to 1676. The Native Americans' last-ditch effort was to avoid recognizing English authority and stop English settlement on their native lands. The war is named after Wampanoag chief Metacom, later known as Philip or King Philip, who led the 14-month bloody rebellion. After the Pequot War of 1637, the New England colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Haven realized the need to form a military alliance to defend against their common enemies. After much debate, they formed the New England Confederation on May 19, 1643. Over the subsequent years, the New England Confederation fought the Wampanoag Indians for some other local tribes during the King Philip's War. The Mohegan and Mohawk tribes, however, fought for the English. Metacom was the second son of Wampanoag's chief Massasoit, who was negotiated a peace treaty with the colonists at Plymouth Plantation. But the agreement wasn't enough to stop the colonists' encroachment on Indian lands. After Massasoit's death in 1661, his eldest son Wamsuta, later named Alexander, succeeded him. In 1662, the English arrested Alexander on suspicion of plotting war. During questioning, he died, and Metacom, now known as Philip, as many Wampanoags took English names, came to power. In January 1675, Christian Indian John Sassamon warned Plymouth Colony that Philip planned to attack English settlements. The English ignored the warning and soon found Sassamon's murdered body in an icy pond. A jury made up of colonists and Indians found 3 Wampanoag men guilty for Sassamon's murder and hanged them on June 8, 1675. Their execution incensed Philip, whom the English had accused of plotting Sassamon's murder, and ignited tensions between the Wampanoag and the colonists, setting the stage for war. Between June 20 and June 23, 1675, the Wampanoag carried out a series of raids against the Swansea colony of Massachusetts, killing many colonists and pillaging and destroying property. English officials responded by sending the military to destroy Philip's home village of Mount Hope, Rhode Island. The war spread during the summer of 1675 at the Wampanoag joined the Algonquin warriors, attacked settlements throughout the Plymouth colony. On September 9, 1675, the New England Confederation declared war against King Philip and his followers. A week later, around 700 Nipmuc Indians ambushed a militia group escorting a wagon train of colonists. almost all colonists and militia were killed in the fighting, known as the Battle of Bloody Brook. Hoping to prevent a spring Indian onslaught, Plymouth Colony's governor Josiah Winslow gathered the colonial militia and attacked a massive Narragansett and Wampanoag fortification near the Great Swamp in West Kingston, Rhode Island, on December 9, 1675. It is estimated that 300 Indians, including women and children, were either killed in the attack or died from exposure to the winter elements. Some were burned alive at stake. The battle forced the weakened Narragansett, who had tried to remain neutral, to join King Philip's fight under Chief Canochet. After the Great Swamp fight, King Philip set up camp in New York, possibly enlisting Mohawks' assistance. But the Mohawk attacked the Wampanoag and forced them to retreat to New England, with the Mohawk in hot pursuit. During the winter of 1676, King Philip's Confederacy continued to assault English colonies throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine, proving there was no safe place for colonists to hide. The Indians attacked Plymouth Plantation and forced most of its citizens to the coast and, led by Chief Canochet, annihilated Providence, Rhode Island. In an attack known as the Nine Men's Misery incident, Narragansett Indians ambushed around 60 colonists and 20 Christian Wampanoag Indians. The Indians killed almost all the colonists, however. 9 men were captured and gruesomely tortured to death. Throughout the spring of 1676, the tide began to turn for the English. In April, Chief Canochet was captured, handed over to the Mohegans, and shot, beheaded, and quartered, leaving the Narragansett without a leader. In May, the militia attacked and killed up to 200 Narragansett at the Battle of Turner Falls, near the Connecticut River. By midsummer, the English started giving amnesty to some Indians. A lot of war-weary Indians surrendered, however. The English sold many into slavery. By the late summer, King Philip and his allies were weakened and on the run. The English soldier John Alderman shot and killed King Philip on August 20, 1676, at Mount Hope. King Philip was hung, beheaded, drawn, and quartered. His head was placed on a spike and displayed at the Plymouth colony for 2 decades. King Philip's death effectively ended the war, although clashes continued throughout New England until the Treaty of Casco was signed in 1678. King Philip's War is considered the bloodiest war per capita in U.S. history. It left several hundred colonists dead and dozens of English settlements destroyed or heavily damaged. Thousands of Indians were killed, wounded, or captured, and sold into slavery or indentured servitude. The war decimated the Wampanoags and many smaller tribes and mostly ended Indian resistance in southern New England, paving additional English settlements. The business of slavery. The laws relating to slavery and their enforcement hardened in the second half of the 17th century, and the prospects for Africans and their descendants grew increasingly dim. By 1640, the Virginia courts had sentenced at least one black servant, John Punch, to slavery. In 1656, Elizabeth Key won a suit for freedom based on her father's status as a free Englishman and had baptized as a Christian in the Church of England. In 1662, the Virginia House of Burgess passed a law with the doctrine of partus, stating that any child born in the colony would follow the status of its mother, bond, or free. This was an overturn of a long-held principle of English common law, whereby a child's status followed that of the father, and enabled slaveholders and other white men to hide the mixed-race children born of their rape of slave women and remove the responsibility to acknowledge, support, or emancipate the children. During the second half of the 17th century, The British economy improved, and the supply of British indentured servants declined, as poor Britons had better economic opportunities at home. At the same time, Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 led planters to worry about the prospective dangers of creating a large class of restless, landless, and relatively poor white men, most of them former indentured servants. Wealthy Virginia and Maryland planters began to buy slaves in preference to indentured servants during the 1660s and 1670s, and more impoverished farmers followed suit by the 1700s. Slaves cost more than servants, so initially, only the wealthy could invest in slaves. The first British colonist in Carolina introduced African slavery into the colonies in 1670, the year the settlement was founded, and Charleston ultimately became the busiest slave port in North America. Slavery spread from the South Carolina low country first to Georgia, then across the deep south as Virginia's influence had crossed the Appalachians to Kentucky and Tennessee. Northerners also purchased slaves, though on a much smaller scale. Enslaved people outnumbered free whites in South Carolina from the early 1700s to the Civil War. An authoritarian political culture evolved to prevent slave rebellion and justify white slaveholding. Northern slaves typically dwelled in towns, rather than plantations as in the South, and worked as artisans and artisan assistants, sailors and longshoremen, and domestic servants. In 1672, King Charles II rechartered the Royal African Company as an English monopoly for the African slave and commodities trade. After that, in 1698, by statute, the English Parliament opened the trade to all English subjects. The slave trade to the mid-Atlantic colonies increased substantially in the 1680s, and by 1710, the African population in Virginia had increased to 23,000. Maryland contained 8,000 Africans. In early 18th century, England passed Spain and Portugal to become the world's leading slave trader. The North American royal colonies not only imported Africans but also captured Native Americans, pressing them into slavery. Many Native Americans were shipped as slaves to the Caribbean. Many of these slaves from the British colonies were able to escape by heading south to Florida's Spanish territory. They were given their freedom if they declared their allegiance to the King of Spain and accepted the Catholic Church. In 1739, Fort Mose was established by African American freedmen and became the northern defense post for St. Augustine. In 1740, English forces attacked and destroyed the fort, which was then later rebuilt in 1752. Because the fort had become a haven for escaped slaves from the English colonies to the north, it was considered a precursor site for the Underground Railroad. Chattel slavery developed in British North America before the full legal apparatus that supported slavery did. During the late 17th century and early 18th century, harsh new slave codes limited African slaves' rights and cut off their avenues to freedom. The first full-scale slave code in British North America was South Carolina's in 1698, which was modeled on the colonial Barbados Slave Code of 1661. It was updated and expanded regularly throughout the 18th century. In 1691, Virginia law prohibited slaveholders from emancipating slaves unless they paid for the freedmen's transportation out of Virginia. Virginia criminalized interracial marriage in 1691, and subsequent laws abolished blacks' rights to vote, hold office, and bear arms. Virginia's House of the Burgess established the necessary legal framework for slavery in 1705. In the 17th century, the East India Company began bringing indentured Indian servants to the Americas colony. In 1680, due to anti-miscegenation laws, a mixed-race girl born to an Indian father and an Irish mother were classified as mulatto and sold into slavery. This is not to be conflated as all Irish are sold into slavery, as this seems to be a false narrative that floats around even to this day. Slavery had been practiced in Ireland for centuries before a Welsh slave in the 5th century got away, spent some years in France, and then returned to achieve a mass conversion among the Irish to become St. Patrick. Broca, another slave of the Irish, was the father of St. Bridget. Dublin was a primary slave market, especially after the Vikings renovated the town into an efficient port. It must be added, however, slavery was a looser system in those days, and servitude, whether to be Irishman, Roman, Norseman, or Norman, did not necessarily mean servitude for life. The trafficking of the Irish for cheap labor began in earnest when England started to colonize the New World, and at the same time increased their domination of Ireland. Rebels and criminals, often their families, often found themselves being deported, mostly to island plantations in the Caribbean and later to penal colonies in Australia. However, they were often indentured servants for 4 to 7 year contracts to work the sugarcane, tobacco, or cotton fields until their time ran out, and they would be released from indenture. In practice, the masters sometimes extended the indentured time. Others, for whom the indentured servants was not the lifelong investment that a black or Native American slave was, had no compunction about working the indentured servant to death in his last year. For the Irish, the worst period of indentured servitude began with the rebellion against the Irish rule in 1641, through the Cromwellian Commonwealth. Through the early 18th century, mass deportation moved the, quote, Irish problem elsewhere, essentially. Nevertheless, the vast majority of indentured Irish, once their time was up, left the plantations, save some 10% that established their own, tried their luck anywhere else in the colonies, and often, despite centuries of anti-Irish prejudice, managing to establish new lives and livelihoods. Still, a good many former indentured servants released without any education, practical training, money, or prospects, and a significantly reduced outlook regarding the value of human life in general, made their way to ports such as Kingston, Jamaica, and found their way to more profitable employment under such enterprising sea captains such as Henry Morgan. Although, as mentioned before, indentured service could be worse than slavery, it was at least more temporary than the practice on African slaves. However, a myth has risen equating the two. Bacon's Rebellion. Don't get too excited. It's not that kind of bacon. Jamestown had once been a bustling capital of the colony of Virginia. Now was a smoldering ruin, and Nathaniel Bacon was on the run. Charismatic and courageous, he had spent the last several months leading a growing group of rebels in a bloody battle against William Berkeley, the colonial governor, and he wasn't about to stop now. Forces would be coming soon from England to take his militia down, but Bacon and his men couldn't surrender. Hunker down, he told them. Hide in the woods for the time being, and keep up the fight when they arrive. Soon Bacon would be dead and his militia defeated. The rebellion he led is commonly thought of as the first armed insurrection by American colonists against Britain and their colonial government. 100 years before the American Revolution, Bacon and his armed rebels ransacked the colonial capital, threatening its governor, and upended Virginia's social order. Many were executed for their actions. Right after the Revolutionary War, Thomas Jefferson and others upheld the event as a brave stand by embattled colonists. Today, though, historians see it as a tussle over the colonial frontier's ownership and an effort to drive Native Americans off their land further. At the time, wealthy settlers had built profitable tobacco plantations and used their crops to pay high colonial taxes. But for the more impoverished Virginians, times were lean. Only people who owned land could vote, and the indentured servants were more indigent Virginians did not feel disenfranchised. Falling tobacco prices had battered poor farmers, and many of the borders of the colony's frontier wanted to expand westward. There, they faced threats from Native Americans intent on protecting their ancestral lands. When the colonists called on their governor for military support, he refused. Berkeley had long tried to balance his colonists' wishes against those of the tribe on Virginia's border, but his attempt to appease all sides failed, mostly when he used new trade rules to increase his wealthy friend's fortunes. Bacon, who had recently arrived in Virginia and was Berkeley's cousin by marriage, was disgusted by what he viewed as the governor's disloyalty and unfairness. In March 1676, after attacking a friendly tribe and falsely accusing them of stealing his corn, Bacon insisted that the governor finance and support a militia to attack Native Americans on the colony's border. Berkeley refused, infuriating Bacon. He began to amass a militia of his own. Drunk on brandy and the prospects of the land that they thought they were entitled to, Bacon and his men headed south. They met a group of Occaneechi people, whom they enlisted to help him fight. The Occaneechi helped out, but was met with a brutal reward. After the skirmish, Bacon and his men turned on them, slaughtering most of the Occaneechi and decimating their village. In response, Berkeley declared Bacon a rebel and scheduled elections for a new assembly to solve the problem for good. But Bacon was immediately elected to that legislative body, and when he headed to Jamestown to begin his tenure there, he was met with a chilly welcome. As the assembly convened, Bacon got on his knees and apologized to the governor. His supporters erupted with cries for the governor to let him lead a new campaign. The governor eventually kicked him out of the assembly. Humiliated and furious, Bacon gathered his troops. A few weeks later, he marched towards Jamestown with 500 supporters and another demand to lead the colony into war against the Native Americans. As Bacon's men stood off with Berkeley's, the governor opened his shirt and showed Bacon his bare chest. "Here, shoot me," yelled Berkeley, daring Bacon to shoot. Instead, Bacon retreated and began traveling throughout Virginia, recruiting other disgruntled rebels. Berkeley accused him of rebellion and treason, and Bacon responded with heated proclamations of his own, accusing the governor of having sold his friends, country, and the liberties of his loyal subjects to barbarous heathens. He accused Berkeley of trying to force the colonists into a civil war, while fomenting one of his own. Bacon and his men began conducting their raids around the colony, attacking friendly tribes like the Pamunkey people, and gathering more supporters as they went. Among the mob were black and white indentured servants. In September, matters came to a head. Governor Berkeley traveled throughout Virginia to recruit supporters of his own and returned to Jamestown to issue a final proclamation condemning Bacon. In response, Bacon and his men rushed into Jamestown, burning and pillaging as they went. On the night of September 19, they torched the entire town, burning it to the ground. As the embattled governor fled, Bacon's supporters terrorized the city's remains and the governor's supporters. Finally, the crown intervened. News had taken months to travel to England, and Charles II took until late October to respond. By then, Bacon's rebellion was falling to pieces. The day before Charles II's proclamation about the uprising, Bacon died of dysentery. Without their leader, the rebels floundered. Berkeley, assisted by an English naval squadron, soon defeated the rebels' remainder, and Berkeley returned to Jamestown. There he exacted his final revenge against Bacon. At Berkeley's insistence, 23 of Bacon's supporters were hanged. The governor would have hanged half the country if they had let him alone, remarked one observer. Berkeley didn't get the chance. Charles II's commission clashed with the governor, whose authority had been undermined and whose 27 years of governments were now ending in disgrace. After arguing with the commissioner, who had been given the power to end Berkeley's governorship, Berkeley went to England to beg Charles II to keep his post. Sick and weakened by the crossing, 6 weeks later, Berkeley landed in London a broken man. Gone were his allies at court. The old governor's one desire was to clear himself with the king. There was no opportunity. Berkeley died before he even saw the king. In the aftermath of the rebellion, white planters reacted with alarm to the anger they had seen among the black Virginians who had joined Bacon's rebellion. The planters had not been able to control this rowdy labor force of servants and slaves. But soon after Bacon's rebellion, they increasingly distinguished between people of African descent and people of European descent. They enact laws which say that people of African descent are hereditary slaves. Planters feared what their white indentured servants could do, so they slowly eliminated the system, relying on enslaved black people to work their plantations. The backlash from Bacon's rebellion is credited with helping kick off the racial distinctions that defined the colonies and the United States that followed. As for the Native Americans caught in the crosshairs of Bacon and Berkeley's feud, the few Occaneechi people who remained fled their traditional lands after the massacre. Eventually, they merged with another tribe. Colonial Gambling. Human vice are ancient affairs, but they had a rebirth in the New World. Games of chance came to British American colonies with the first settlers. Attitudes towards gambling varied greatly from community to community, but there were no large-scale restrictions on the practice at the time. By the 1680s, an emerging upper class in Virginia cemented their economic status through an iron grip on horse racing gambling. Heavy bettors demonstrated their courage and skill while promoting shared values and consciousness among the social elite. This group of wealthy Virginians landowner became elaborate rules, established by formal codes that dictated how much to bet and marginalized the role of the non-elite. They developed a code of honor regarding greed, individualism, materialism, personal relationships, and the right to be rulers. Not until the mid-18th century, where Baptists and Methodists denounced gambling as sinful, was there any challenge to the social, political, and economic dominance of this Virginian overclass. Approximately 392 lotteries that were held in the 13 colonies using newspaper advertisements during the colonial era. Lotteries were used not only as a form of entertainment, but as a source of revenue to help fund each of the original 13 colonies. The financiers of Jamestown, Virginia, funded lotteries to raise money to support their colony. These lotteries often featured instant winners. In 1769, a restriction that was placed on lotteries by the British Crown became one of the many issues that fueled tension between the colonies and Britain before the American Revolution. People of all ages enjoyed gambling, including children. In the late 16th century, records show that parents gave their children small amounts of money to play. More active games included Hoodman's Blind, or Blind Man's Bluff, Stool Ball, which is like cricket, and Hot Cockles, in which a blindfolded player tried to guess who tapped him on the back. Children enjoyed leapfrog and daring game of Snap Apple, in which a player attempted to bite into an apple fastened at one end of the stick, which had a lighted candle attached to the other end. The stick was suspended from the ceiling by a string. People in the 17th century Virginia were mainly interested in how good or bad fortune played out in their lives. Although one older woman named Catherine Grady was hanged as a witch in 1659 on a ship headed to Virginia, there are no records of anyone being executed for that crime in Virginia itself. The gentlemen of Virginia were deeply absorbed into studying stars, planets, spheres, and prophecies, not as signs of God's purpose, but as a clue to their fate. Virginia's interest in fortune was linked with their obsession with gambling, which continued into the 18th century. In colonial America, community lotteries helped pay some of the taxes used to fund the Revolutionary War. But early Americans took the lottery as a step further, often wagering on horse races. The sport was so popular that horse racing quickly evolved from a small neighborhood activity to a much larger spectacle. The country's first racetrack, the Newark Course, was built in 1665 on Long Island, near what is now the town of Hampstead. Therefore, horse racing is considered America's first organized sport of any kind, as it dates to the 17th century. Interestingly, the sport was passed down from our British ancestors, including the Newmarket name. James I, King of Scotland and England until 1625, frequented Newmarket racetrack in Suffolk, earning it the name of the, quote, the original home of horse racing. His grandson, Charles II, even competed in the Newark race in 1671. While it's likely that spectators did not bet on races that included a reigning monarch, horse race wagering in the UK became popular in the early 18th century. Horse race wagering looks a little different today than it did in the 18th century. Modern horse race betting is much more complex, with numerous race types offered depending on eligible horses, past success, and racing experience. Birth of sport. As society improves, so does its recreation. Early American settlers faced tensions for participating in sports against certain men's values, like Governor William Bradford. However, many colonists still held onto the sporting ways that they had grown accustomed to in England. Many of the settlers lived far away from one another. This made it difficult to get together and participate in various sporting events. In England, they lived close together, making it easy to get for the people to come together and participate in multiple events. In colonial America, sports and games would only occur when certain factors fell in line with one another. These factors included times of increased wealth, populations, and growth of cities. Sports or games were commonly played during holidays or celebrations. Some games that were played included stool ball, foot races, horseshoes, and bowling. These games allowed single men to show off and impress women at the same time. They also loved to participate in violent games or sports. They would take part in wrestling, cockfighting, or baiting bulls. Sports events or competitions allowed colonists to escape some of the hardships of daily life. They also allowed for mating rituals and courtship. These games also allowed for people to express their anger in socially acceptable ways. It is alright to beat someone up in a game, but it's not okay to do it outside of the game. And lastly, they allowed cities to get together and show their support. This allowed the town to become unified. In Chesapeake society, sports occupied a great deal of attention at every social level, starting at the top. In England, hunting was severely restricted by landowners. In America, the game was more than plentiful. Everyone, including servants and slaves, could and did hunt, so there was no social distinction to be had. In 1691, Sir Francis Nicholson, the governor of Virginia, organized competitions for the, quote, better sort of Virginians who are bachelors, end quote, and he offered prizes, quote, to be shot for, wrestled, played at backswords, and run by horse and foot, end quote. Horse racing was the main event. The typical farmer did not own a horse in the first place, and racing was a matter for gentlemen only. But ordinary farmers were spectators and gamblers. Selected slaves often became skilled horse trainers. Horse racing was especially crucial for knitting the gentry together. The race was a major public event designed to demonstrate to the world the gentry's superior social status through expensive breeding, training, boasting, and gambling, and especially winning the race themselves. Historians explain that horse racing and high-stakes gambling were essential to maintaining the status of the gentry. When they publicly bet a large fraction of their wealth on a favorite horse, it told the world that competitiveness, individualism, and materialism were the core elements of gentry values. Colonial boys, as today, practiced sports pursued by their fathers. Baste the bear, which is after bear baiting, but with the bear tethered by a short rope to his keeper, who tried to touch all who attempted to bait the bear with a twisted handkerchief. Ice skating, archery, cricket, and football, a wild game which Edward III briefly prohibited by edict because it impeded the progress of archery. Boys here also knew how to javelin toss, fence, stilt walk, swim, and wrestle. Salem witch trials. Superstitions ran rampant in the Americas. The Salem witch trials occurred in colonial Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693. More than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, the devil's magic, and 20 were executed. Eventually, the colony admitted the trials were a mistake and compensated the families of those convicted. Since then, the trial story has become synonymous with the paranoia and injustice, and it continues to attract popular imagination more than 300 years later. Several centuries ago, many practicing Christians and those of other religions had a strong belief that the devil could give certain people known as witches the power to harm others in return for their loyalty. A witchcraft craze rippled through Europe from the 1300s to the end of the 1600s. Tens of thousands of supposed witches, mostly women, were executed. Though the Salem witch trials came on just as the European craze was winding down, local circumstances explain their onset. In 1689, English rulers Mary and William started a war with France in the American colonies. Known as King William's War to Colonists, it ravaged upstate New York, Nova Scotia, and Quebec, sending refugees into the county of Essex and, specifically, Salem village in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The displaced people created a strain on Salem's resources. This aggravated the existing rivalry between families with ties to Salem's port's wealth and those who still depended on agriculture. Controversy also brewed over the Reverend Samuel Parris, who became Salem's village's first ordained minister in 1689, and was disliked because of his rigid ways and greedy nature. The Puritan villagers believed all the quarreling was the work of the devil. In January of 1692, Reverend Parris's daughter Elizabeth, age 9, and niece Abigail Williams, age 11, started having fits. They screamed, threw things, uttered penicular sounds, and contorted themselves into strange positions. And a local doctor blamed the supernatural. Another girl, Ann Putnam, age 11, experienced similar episodes. On February 29, under pressure from magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hawthorne, the girls blamed 3 women for afflicting them. Tibuda, the parish Caribbean slave, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an utterly impoverished woman. All 3 women were brought before the local magistrate and interrogated for several days, starting on March 1, 1692. Osborne claimed innocence, as did Good. But Tituba confessed, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." She described detailed images of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a black man who wanted her to sign his book. She admitted that she had signed the book and said several other witches were looking to destroy Puritans. All 3 women were put in jail. With the seed of paranoia planted, a stream of accusations followed for the next few months. Charges against Martha Corey, a local member of the church in Salem Village, greatly concerned the community. If she could be a witch, anyone could. Magistrates even questioned Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, Dorothy, and her timid answers were construed as a confession. The questioning got more serious in April when Deputy Governor Thomas Danforth and his assistants attended the hearing. Dozens of people from Salem and other Massachusetts villages were brought in for questioning. On May 27, 1692, Governor William Phipps ordered the establishment of a special court in Suffolk, Essex, and Middlesex counties. The first case brought to the Superior Court was Bridget Bishop, an older woman known for her gossipy habits and promiscuity. When asked if she committed witchcraft, Bishop responded, "I am as innocent as a child unborn." The defense must not have been convincing because she was found guilty and, on June 10th, became the first person hanged on what was later called Gallows Hill. 5 days later, respected Minister Cotton Mather wrote a letter imploring the court not to allow spectral evidence, testimony about dreams and visions. The court largely ignored this request, and 5 people were sentenced and hanged in July, 5 more in August, and 8 in September. October 3rd, following his son's footsteps, increased Mather. President of Harvard denounced the use of spectral evidence. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person is condemned. In response to Mather's plea and his wife being questioned for witchcraft, Governor Phipps prohibited further arrests, released many accused witches, and dissolved the court on October 29. Phipps replaced it with a Superior Court of Judicature, which disallowed spectral evidence and condemned 3 out of the 56 defendants. Phipps eventually pardoned all who were in prison on witchcraft charges on May 1693. But the damage had been done. 19 were hanged on Gallows Hill. A 71-year-old man was pressed to death with heavy stones. Several people died in jail, and nearly 200 people overall had been accused of practicing the devil's magic. Following the trials and execution, many involved, like Judge Samuel Sewell, publicly confessed error and guilt. On January 14, 1697, the General Court ordered a day of fasting and soul-searching for Salem's tragedy. In 1702, the court declared the trials unlawful, and in 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring those accused rights and good names and granted £600 restitution to their heirs. However, it was not until 1957, more than 250 years later, that Massachusetts formally apologized for the events of 1692. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.